So, what's the best banjo for a beginner? And do you have to spend a ton of money to get a decent one? Those are questions that I hear all the time. So, as you may know, most banjos on the market today cost anywhere from $1,000 to several thousands of dollars. But if you're just getting started, you may not be ready to spend that kind of money, which is totally reasonable. And you might have seen some models out there that are less expensive and wondered if you can actually get a halfway decent banjo at a more affordable price. And I'm pleased to say that the answer is yes. Now, it's also possible to get a really lousy banjo at those prices. So in this video, I'm going to review and play two of the most budget-friendly banjos that are on the market today, both coming in at around $300 new, that are also great for starting out on when learning clawhammer banjo. I'm also going to cover the 6 key things that I always check when I get a new banjo to ensure that it sounds as good as it can and is as playable as possible. The best, most expensive banjo in the world that's not set up properly is going to sound a whole lot worse than even the cheapest banjo that is set up properly. So if you're just starting out and you already have a banjo, I'll still recommend watching to ensure that you're getting the best sound and playability out of your instrument, and so that you learn all about the things that contribute to how your banjo sounds and plays. Also, if you want to know about other gear that I recommend that you get when you're getting started, I've put out a video on that as well. And you can also download a guide to all the recommended gear along with the 6 steps that I'm going to cover for setup in this video using the link in the video description. So you can go ahead and click that link now in the description to grab that. Okay, so there are 2 main criteria that a good starter banjo needs to fulfill. First, it has to sound like a banjo. If you're relatively new to the instrument, most banjos are generally going to sound the same to you. Like anything, the more familiar you become with it, the more you'll start to perceive subtle differences, but that usually won't be true in the beginning. And the thing is, 90% or more of our enjoyment from playing the banjo comes simply from the fact that it sounds like a banjo. That's because banjos sound awesome. As long as it has the right parts that are put together the right way, any banjo, no matter what it costs, is going to deliver that great banjo sound. Higher end materials might add a bit more sonic pleasure, but in the beginning stages, the chances are you won't even notice those differences anyway. And then the second most important factor is that it must be very playable. Playability is the most crucial feature of a starter banjo. As a beginner, you're already facing the challenge of learning how to play. And the last thing you need is for the instrument itself to add to that challenge unnecessarily. So you want your first banjo to be as easy to play as possible. Now, there are 3 main things that determine a banjo's tone and playability. 1 is the quality of the materials, 2, the quality of the craftsmanship, and 3 is the final setup. And if you remember nothing else from this video, remember that the single most important thing about any starter banjo is that it's been set up well. And I'm going to show you what that means. So at this time, there are 2 banjos in this category that are well constructed and are great starter options when they're properly set up. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the Gold Tone AC1 banjo. So this banjo currently sells for around $270. That's what I got it for. By the way, I'm not getting anything for recommending these banjos. These are just the ones that I like. So this is, again, made by Gold Tone. Gold Tone is a company that specializes in banjos. And while this banjo is manufactured in China, after it's made, it's shipped to their headquarters in Titusville, Florida, where it receives a full setup before it's then shipped to either a distributor or directly to a customer. And as I've already said, setup is hugely important for banjos, especially ones in this price range, and it's something that beginners tend to know the least about, so that's a great thing that it gets a setup. All of the banjos in this price range are going to be made in an overseas factory, usually China, and they're not going to receive a final setup there. So this approach of manufacturing overseas but setting it up in the US helps to keep costs down while still maintaining a higher level of quality control. So gold tone refers to the AC1 as a composite banjo, presumably because it has a composite rim, so this part here. This is one of the ways they keep the cost down. So instead of using a 3-ply or block style wood rim, it uses this composite material. I'm not sure what the exact composition is, but it looks like it includes carbon fiber. And the idea here is to get the stability and hardness of wood and its sonic characteristics without the higher cost. And I actually like the look of this rim. It's also lighter than the typical wooden rim, which helps keep the weight of the banjo down, which is nice. This one's really light. It weighs in at just under 4 pounds. You can easily hold it with one hand. The neck of the AC1, it says it's made of NATO, which is a more affordable wood than maple or mahogany, which are the more traditional neck woods. But it offers similar qualities, so at a lower cost. And then it's got this black satin finish, which I think looks pretty cool. The tuners are the guitar-style tuners that stick out from the side, rather than the traditional planetary tuners that stick out from the back on a banjo. That's also typical of banjos in this price range. It's a way of saving some money. That also means they have a lower gear ratio, which will make fine adjustments a little bit harder. But again, it's another way of keeping costs down. I do prefer the look of the planetary tuners. It's what I'm used to. But from a functional standpoint, these tuners work fine. The banjo has a rosewood fingerboard with standard dot fret markers at the usual spots. Has a standard Remo frosted head, a maple bridge with an ebony cap, also standard, and a single coordinator rod in the back. Overall, feels solid and well made, and the components, all fitted well together. And again, it's nice and light. So now I'm going to run through the things I typically check whenever I get a new banjo to ensure that it's been set up well. Again, you could have the most well-made banjo in the world by the most skilled builder with the highest quality materials, but if there are issues with the setup, it's going to sound terrible. And that's not the builder's fault. It's not the sign of a bad banjo. It's entirely normal for certain things to happen in the process of shipping and handling and changes in climate and so on that will need to be adjusted once you get the banjo. The very first thing I check is always the placement of the bridge. So this is the bridge here, this piece of wood that the strings sit on top of. If the bridge is not in the right place, the banjo is going to sound awful no matter how much you paid for it. And it's actually super common for people to think they have a terrible banjo when the only issue is a misplaced bridge. The bridge on a banjo is only held down by the tension on the strings, so it can move up and down. And that can happen just from it being handled. And in fact, people will often lower the tension on the strings during shipping to help reduce the chances of damage, which means that the bridge may shift, or it may even be laid down on its side when you receive it. But even though the bridge can move, there's only one spot on the head where it should be. Only one spot that will allow all the notes to be in tune up and down the neck. So technically the distance from the nut, which is this part, to the 12th fret here should be the same as the distance from the 12th fret to the top of the bridge. However, the best way to test if it's set up properly is actually just to play an open string on the banjo and then play a note on that same string at the 12th fret. And those two notes should be exactly the same on your tuner, because the note at the 12th fret should be an octave higher than the open string notes. For example, if I play my open first string tuned to a D, and then I fret that at the 12th fret, that note should also be a D. If my note is sharp, meaning the tuner is showing that it's to the right of the middle on a tuner that goes left to right, or above on one that goes up and down, if it's to the right or above, that means it's sharp, and that means the distance from the 12th fret to the bridge is too short. So that means I need to move my bridge down towards the tailpiece. Sometimes you can move it a little bit with the strings still tuned to pitch, but it is easier to move if you tune them down and lower the tension on the strings. Then move it, then tune it back up, and check again. Now, if the note that I fret at the 12th fret is flat compared to the open string, then I need to move the bridge towards the nut in order to shorten the distance, because that means that this distance is too long. On this particular gold tone, the bridge actually came already in the correct spot, which is great, probably because of that setup process that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes you'll also see small pencil marks made on the banjo head that indicates where the bridge should line up. So if it's not in the right spot, you have an easy target to move it to. That's a nice thing for people to do before they send a banjo out. So always look for that first when you're setting your bridge. And if you don't see any pencil marks, I recommend that once you've set your bridge, that you go ahead and make those marks on the top of the feet here on either side. So kind of where the corners are, a mark on each corner, and that will tell you in the future if your bridge ever moves, or if you change it out for another one, where you need to line it up at. The next thing I'm going to check is the tension of the head. So the banjo head is a drum head, and it's held in place by these hooks around the rim that put it under tension. And the tension of the head makes a huge difference in the way the banjo sounds. I would say that after a misplaced bridge, a head that is too loose is the second most common reason people mistakenly think that they have a bad banjo. And heads will stretch some after they're first put on, so almost certainly a new banjo that you get is going to be on the loose side. The banjo head will be. If you play a banjo in a store that doesn't specialize in banjos, like a Guitar Center or something, the head is almost going to be ridiculously loose and sound awful. Now, I can usually hear if a head is too loose or looser than I like it. But you can also check by pressing your thumb into the head, and if it gives pretty easily, it's probably too loose. On this banjo, I'd say the head is a little loose, especially for my taste, and would sound better to me if it was tightened, but it's not terrible. It was almost certainly tightened correctly during the initial setup, and any loosening that's happened is due to just the natural stretching or changes in climate that I mentioned earlier. So to tighten the head, you just tighten the nuts on the hooks. So these little nuts, and your banjo should usually come with a little wrench that's used to do that. And you do this by just putting the wrench on, giving it a little bit of a turn, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 45 degrees. Do that all the way around. Then play the banjo again, see how it sounds, press it in, see if it's gotten tighter. If it's still too loose, try that again. And you're repeating that process until you get to where you like it, or you get to a point where the banjo is starting to sound a little bit choked off. That's usually the sign that it's gotten too tight, and then you can just go back and loosen them to the last setting that you had. It's pretty hard to over tighten the head, and cause damage or break it. So don't be afraid to experiment. Doing so is also great for helping you to hear how the tension of the head impacts the tone, because that's one of the variables you have to get the banjo sounding like you want it to sound. The next thing I'll check are the tuners. So I want to make sure that they're turning smoothly, they're not sticking, and I want to make sure that they're not too loose. So if I tune it and then I notice one of the strings is losing pitch, it's almost always because the tuner is too loose, because one of these screws that goes into the tuning post is not tight enough. So usually just tightening those up will fix an issue with the string losing its tension after you've tuned it up. And those are just tightened with a small screwdriver. The next thing to check is the action of the banjo, which is just the height of the strings over the frets. In general, you want the strings high enough so that they don't buzz when they're vibrating, but not so high that they're hard to press down. And you can gauge this pretty well just by eyeballing it and playing it. If they look too high or off the fretboard as you go up the neck, or if you find they're hard to press down up here, then the action may be too high. If it buzzes a lot, it may be too low. A good target for the action is for the strings to be about 1/8 of an inch above the 12th fret. And one way you can measure this is just to take like an index card or a business card, sit it on the 12th fret, and then just make a mark where you see the string, and then take that off and measure that, and that can tell you how far that string is off of the 12th fret. So again, somewhere around the neighborhood of 1/8 of an inch is typically ideal. If it's too high or low, the easiest way to change your action, especially if it's a minor adjustment, is to change the height of the bridge, to use a bridge that's a different height. So standard bridge height is 5/8 of an inch, but if you need to lower the action, you could swap it for a shorter one, like a 1/2 inch bridge. If it's too low, you could use a taller bridge, like a 3/4 inch. You can also adjust the action by tweaking the coordinator rod, but that's not something generally recommended for beginners. The next thing to do is check for buzzes. I already know it's not buzzing when I'm fretting the open strings, but I'll also just fret it down the neck to make sure I'm not hearing anything, and I'm not hearing any buzzes on this instrument. If I do, check the hardware, all the hardware to make sure everything's tight. So these nuts on the around the rim, the screws in the tuners, and on the back here, anything on the screw in the tailpiece, making sure all of those are tight. Anything that's loose is typically going to buzz when the instrument is vibrating. If that's not the issue and the action is okay and it's still buzzing, then it's best to take it to a professional who can try and diagnose and fix the issue for you. And then the last thing I'll check is the condition of the strings and the string gauges. So the strings on a new instrument should be new, but if it's not a new instrument, then you'd want to check and see if they look dirty or oxidized and they're in need of changing. And then as far as the gauges of the strings, which refers to their thickness, I personally prefer light gauge strings, and I definitely think beginners should start with light gauge strings. As I mentioned, one of our 2 goals for a starter banjo is for the banjo to be as playable as possible, and light gauge strings are just easier to fret and make for a more responsive instrument. They're also a great way to make a less expensive instrument sound better. And if you're playing clawhammer, as many folks buying an open back will be, medium gauge strings will also tend to wear out your nails faster. This particular banjo does have medium gauge strings on it, which unfortunately seems to be the standard that are shipped when they're shipped out. I wish that weren't the case, especially for banjos that are likely to find their way into the hands of beginners, but that's my only criticism really of this banjo so far. So now I'm going to tighten the head a little bit and then come back and play it so you can see how it sounds. So honestly, I think it sounds pretty darn good. It sounds like a banjo, which again is most of the battle. So goal number 1 has been met. It's also playable and responsive, and I know it will be even more so after I put some light gauge strings on it. All right, so the next banjo that I have here in the under $500 price range is the Recording King Dirty 30s, which sells for around $300. It's quite similar to the Gold Tone in terms of materials. The rim is a multiply wood rim rather than a composite, according to the site. The neck, it says, is maple, but the fretboard is a composite material, and it has dot inlays. It has a satin finish on it, but a wood color. And overall, everything is, again, well put together. It's also about the same weight, real light, but it feels solid. These banjos are also made in China, but unlike Gold Tone, they don't undergo a final setup by the manufacturer. That means it's only going to be properly set up if you buy it from someone who knows banjos and can do that setup for you. If not, you'll have to do that for yourself. So I'll run through the steps that I did before. First thing, checking to see if the bridge is in the right place. And I see that so I've got my open string here tuned to a D. This note here, the 12th fret, is way sharp. And it sounds just awful. So again, it's not because it's a bad banjo, but simply because the bridge is just in the right place. So it's just way sharp, so that means the length between the 12th fret and the bridge is too short. I need to bring this a good bit back towards the tailpiece. So I'm gonna fix the bridge and be right back. All right, so I now have the bridge in the right spot. This open string matches the 12th fret. It's not sharp anymore. And it already is sounding better than it did. Next, let's check the head tension. Now I can already tell just by playing this, it is way too loose for me. I can feel that by pressing into the head, so I'm gonna need to tighten this head a good bit. The tuners are working well. They're smooth, they're not loose, they're the right amount of tension, and the strings are holding their tension. The action is good, it feels right. It's gonna measure right around 1/8 of an inch. It's not too high, not too low. I'll also check for buzzes. Again, I can hear that the open strings, there are not any buzzes. I'm not hearing any as I go up and down the neck, so that seems to be okay. And then finally for the strings, once again, these also feel like medium gauge strings. I wish they would use lights. They don't seem to be as thick as the set that was on the Gold Tone, though. So now I'm gonna go ahead and bring up the head tension to where I want it, and then I'll come back and play this one for you. once again, overall, it sounds great, especially at this price point, because it sounds like a banjo, and it's nice and playable now. Again, it will sound even better and play even better after I put some light gauge strings on it. I like the Diodario EJ69s, by the way. This is why I think these two banjos are currently the best options for a starter banjo at this price point, which is around $300. They're absolutely both suitable for learning on, and it's unlikely you're going to notice a huge difference at this point in time between these and banjos that are much higher priced. And then by the time you do start to notice those differences, you'll likely have saved up enough of your pennies to upgrade. The only real difference between the Gold Tone and the Recording King is that you're more likely to need to do some of the setup work yourself with the Recording King to get it sounding its best. Otherwise, I think they're comparable and both great options. And if you remember nothing else, again, remember the most important thing about whatever banjo you start on is that it's been set up well, so that it's not any harder to play than it should be, and it sounds as good as it should sound. And if you feel less confident about doing the setup yourself, or you don't want to worry as much about it, the Gold Tone is probably the better option. If you already have a banjo, then just use that. Again, just do the setup check that I just went through, or if you can, take it to someone who knows how to set up a banjo. All right, that's it for this video. Remember, you can download the guide to gear that I recommend when you're first getting started with the banjo, along with an overview of this 6-step checklist. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.